and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. It's Science Fiction Saturday once more. And this time around, we have two science fiction mockumentaries, alternate universe ones. They're not from around here. One's from 2004, one's from 2015. Both of them are lowish budget, but they've got a little bit to say, and they say it in quite interesting ways. Let's do them chronologically, because why not? Which means we go to 2004, and Kevin Willmott wrote and directed a movie. Kevin Willmott later on went to win an Academy Award for writing the screenplay for Black Klansman. And the movie he made is a little thing called C.S.A, Confederate States of America, which is a mockumentary about an alternate universe where the South won the war of Southern aggression, or whatever they call it, the Civil War. This movie's a little hard to find. I had to look around a little bit to find it. It was released by the Weinstein Company, which makes it a little bit up in the air. But I did look for physical media copies of it on eBay, and they're selling for a premium. It is on YouTube, so you can watch it just with a few ads in it. There's not many ads, and credit to YouTube for that. So the movie purports to be a documentary made by the British Broadcasting Service in this alternate universe, where they go to learn the history of the Confederate States of America and to also follow the presidential campaign of a candidate who, for 5 generations, his family's been involved in politics, and his 5 generations back ancestor was quite pivotal in saving the Confederate States of America from bankruptcy after they won the Civil War. It's kind of like a 5-generation Kennedy thing, though Kennedy is a character in this movie, in the alternate universe. So this documentary, with an English voiceover, starts talking about the history of the C.S.A, how it came to be, and the history of it up until the early 2000s. Now, the frame around the frame, if you know what I mean, is that this is being broadcast for the first time in the Confederate States of America. And so every now and then the documentary will be paused so an ad from that universe and from that country can play in between the parts of the documentary, which is a great conceit because it actually fills out the world and the world building really interestingly. There's all sorts of nasty things in there. There's an alternative version of Cops, where people can watch a reality television show where the police and bounty hunters chase down runaway slaves. And there are ads for a whole bunch of different quite racist products. There's a medication for slaves that keeps them docile and stops them running away. There's a gadget called the shackle, which is basically a GPS-linked shackle on the wrists of the slave so that they can't run away, and if they do, they can be tracked. So there are all these little bits of world building in here that are really interesting. The main part of the movie is the history of the C.S.A, where England and France gave soldiers to the Confederacy to support them, and they ultimately defeated the North. That nearly happened in the real world, and the movie tells us this at the end, where if the Confederacy had one more military victory, then England and France would have gone onto their side, and the war would have ended in a different way. So there's a lot of good historic research done on this. And there are a lot of different things that happen in this alternate universe. The C.S.A has a war with Mexico and Central and Southern America, which ends up being their version of Vietnam. They have a war with Canada because Canada took in a whole bunch of not only runaway slaves, but people like Mark Twain and other influential people who were anti-slavery ended up living in Canada. There's a whole century of Black Canadian academics, and one of whom talks face to camera about the history of the Confederacy. There are even little bits of business where the Confederacy talks about Elvis Presley going to exile in Canada because he was arrested a number of times for recording black music, and so he ended up in Canadian exile. There are also an interview with an American historian, C.S.A historian, talking about historical figures and how things came about. So it's a beautifully information dense and yet very flowing documentary about this horrible country and this horrible alternate universe and this horrible thing that almost happened in real life. Kevin Willmott does such a really adept job at threading the needle of showing the absurdities of racism as it was in the Confederacy. There are absurd moments, and there are things like there was a movie made about a certain historical event where an English Shakespearean actor in blackface plays a pivotal black character in the reenactment of a certain historical event, rather than getting a black actor to play it, which wouldn't be right because they're slaves and nobody wants to see them as being intelligent, so it's obviously got to be a white guy in blackface. There's a lot of that gatekeeping stuff that turns up in this movie. There are a couple of weak points. There's another reenactment of a Broadway play, about a historical Broadway play, which doesn't really land very well. But there are enough other bits that do for it to work incredibly well. And there's a little pivot at the end where we see that even though there's been almost a century and a half of this horrible, racist, cruel, nasty, evil regime, people still find a way to fight back. And that is something that I really like. That little bit at the end where something very, very clever happened, and the film crew for this English documentary are pivotal in that thing happening, who are useful idiots to the resistance against the C.S.A. Really interesting doco. And the lovely thing about it, well, lovely is probably not the right word, but one of the great things about it is, at the end of the documentary, they show the real historical products which are shown in the ads that punctuate the documentary. Things like Axle Grease, there's a toothpaste brand, there's a chain fast food franchise that's incredibly racist. There are a whole bunch of other things, including some products which still exist to this day, which have a very, very racist background. And the movie gives that as context just before the credits roll at the end of the movie. I mean, C.S.A. is frighteningly realistic. It's frighteningly plausible. And it's one of those movies where, from a science fiction fan viewpoint, I like the fact that it exists and I would like it to be seen by more people. But it's right at that knife's edge where, if the wrong people see it, it's a documentary which has the potential to be weaponized by some contemporary people in a terrifying way. So even though it was made by a man of colour, in this case Kevin Wilmot, it's a live grenade in a sense. In the same way, a couple of years ago, there was an idea to do a streaming series, not TV anymore, but a streaming series called Confederacy, which was about an alternate universe where the Confederacy won and persisted. And wiser heads prevailed and went, no, we're not going to do that because it will be used and empowered by racists on social media and in other ways. It's even more of a blood grenade. It's a ticking bomb. It's a ticking cultural bomb that people should not assemble. And C.S.A. is probably, in that moment in history, at the last moment in history, where you could make something like this without it being too dangerous and too threatening, something that could be used for nefarious purposes. The Confederacy series was meant to be a kind of alternative version of The Handmaid's Tale. Rather than using sexism, was going to use racism. It was ill-considered and fortunately was never made, at least not in this universe. So you can find it on YouTube, but if you watch it on YouTube, my sincere and heartfelt advice is don't look at the comments. But these kind of lowish budget, quite ambitious movies, I think should be more prominent. And because we've got so much media coming at us all the time, from every direction, a film like C.S.A. doesn't maintain any cultural presence to speak of, which I think is a shame because it's a good, solid film. I saw it 10 years ago. I was looking through some old things that I wrote, and it was mentioned, and I thought I would rewatch it and put it on the channel, which is how I also was reminded of the second movie that I'm going to talk about, a Canadian film, which again is an alternate universe with some incredible world building, called No Man Beyond This Point.
By the end of 1957, 3 out of 4 babies born were coming from fatherless impregnation. And every one of those mothers gave birth to a girl.
The government needs to acknowledge it, or they are going to be sorry.
Women take over, and guess what? We live in a world where there's no wars and no
I'm 37 years old, and I'm the youngest man in the world. I'm going to make the best of the opportunities that I do have, because things aren't going to change.
Excuse me? You can't congregate in groups more than 2.
The pivot point of the alternate universe is 1953, when women start giving birth without men, parthenogenesis, and the documentary crew goes and visits the last man born in the world, who is 37 years old. He's working as a domestic for a couple of women who live together and have children. So the documentary interviews him and interviews the two women who are the family he works for. He does the housework, he does the gardening, he looks after the kids, he does the cooking, all of that kind of stuff. He's a domestic servant, basically. And then we go into the history. 1953, women start giving virgin births, what they call fatherless pregnancies. And at first, nobody believes it's actually happening. Nobody listens to the women. And the powers that be, both secular and theological, have a real problem with it, even when a virgin nun who couldn't have been knocked up in any way is suddenly pregnant and gives birth. The world starts to change. Now, here's the bit where it veers off reality, at least as far as parthenogenesis is concerned. Parthenogenesis exists in the animal world, but the offspring are clones of the parent. There's no other genetic contribution, so there's no genetic diversity. The young are essentially clones of the parent. But in this world, the one impossible thing that they allow is that there is genetic diversity in the offspring. Women are having children, but the children are not clones of their parents. Putting that aside, this guy Andrew, who's the youngest man in the world, he's 37, is a repressed minority. There are a lot of restrictions on men. Surviving men are in sanctuaries. They have a joke where they say the whole continent of Australia has been turned into a men's sanctuary. I know some aunties in various Indigenous communities that have something to say about that. And the spokesman for the men's rights organisation, they use Australian actors to play that guy in various decades. Australian manhood's been demonised in this movie, but that's okay. I can handle that. I'm a big boy now. They show historic footage as they start understanding what happens with this sudden outburst of parthenogenesis. And in the meantime, there's another thing too, which is that children born the normal way and inseminated and impregnating women the normal way doesn't work, because suddenly there's a change in the eggs, and the eggs are not allowing sperm to penetrate them. And if they're artificially injected into the egg, the sperm becomes inert. So there's something going on there at a very deep genetic level, which is preventing normal reproduction. We see a lot of historical stuff. There's the first US president who's a woman in 1965, because at that stage women are a significant majority in the world, and they're starting to take political power. The old religions collapse because they are patriarchal in their very nature, right to the essence, and a kind of nature worship takes over, and a global government forms. And the men's right guy says, what do we get from all this? World peace and electric cars. Which is kind of funny. There's a few funny notes in here, mostly mocking the kind of men's advocate nut jobs that we have in our contemporary world. There's a pivot point about 3/4 of the way through, where the documentary reveals that Andrew is in love with one of the two women he works for, and she's in love with him, and they're secretly meeting and liaising. And then we find out more about this world government and the world that's created in this weird place where another person isn't involved when somebody gets pregnant and has a child. And they start interviewing some government officials and find out that the government is resolutely anti-intimacy. There's no need for human intimacy because it's not required for somebody to have a child. Everybody in the world's menstrual cycles are synchronized up, which is a weird thing, but it happened. And there is a big public education campaign to teach young girls and women that masturbation and orgasm and all those things are not required and are evil. So there's a big anti-sex movement here. There's no talk of lesbianism, which I think is kind of odd. I think it may have widened out the premise a little too much for the filmmakers, which I think may be a missed opportunity. But given that the world changed in 1953, I think gay rights and gay liberation, and particularly lesbian liberation, may be something that this universe didn't address in the same way our one did. So the main social grouping is women who pair off as friends without any intimacy. They're there to raise their children together and to be companions, but the government is strongly against any kind of intimacy because nature has determined that intimacy is not required, which is an incredibly dystopian thing. And there's another side note where they go and interview the men in the men's refuges, and these increasingly aging men are provided with everything they need: food, medical health, accommodation, all that kind of stuff. And then they find out that the women are putting in estrogen into the men's foods to keep them pliable, which again is a kind of rolling, low-level dystopia. It's not only dystopian for the men who are dying out as a part of the human race, but it's dystopian for women who, like any normal people, crave intimacy and crave connection with other people. And suddenly the subject of this documentary is in love with a woman and she's in love with him. And they want to get married, even though marriages between men and women have become illegal and no other kind of marriage exists either. And so there's a real interesting second pivot point in history that occurs in the last quarter of the movie. I think the last words spoken in the movie probably shouldn't have been. I think they're a little too obvious and a little too broad a joke. But again, it's an interesting small film made on a relatively low budget in Canada. It does its world building so well. And the utopia turned dystopia that we get with the world government creeps up on you. And I like that. I like a creeping dystopia where we can only see what the documentary camera sees, and we can only hear the questions answered that the documentary crew ask. And that works well. I think that's a very clever piece of writing. The movie ends on a potential up note, but still things are quite uncertain there. I think small films like this are important. There are subjects in science fiction that, unless a big company like Amazon or Netflix or somebody like that's willing to finance them, they don't get made these days. The market has changed, and the people who run things basically aren't necessarily going to make small, interesting movies like this the way that they were in an era when physical media was more prevalent. You can make a smallish movie, get it released, get a distribution deal with a number of different countries, and make a buck doing it. These days, streaming services are controlled by larger and larger instrumentalities. The exception being things like Broly, the Umbrella streaming service here in Australia, which is doing gangbusters and gets local rights to some really interesting product. But No Men Beyond this point sets up its premise beautifully, and there are all sorts of other little fiddly bits in there where there's no internet because military funding is cut in the 1960s. So the idea of an internet never comes true, and space exploration doesn't continue because Earth-worshipping women don't see a reason to explore the moon. So there was no space race continued after the early mid-1960s. And you see that if you look around carefully in the frame. TVs are cathode ray tubes. They're not flat screens the way they are now. There's a technological advancement that hasn't occurred, and that is mostly in computer technologies. It's a very well put together film, and it thinks through its premise really well. But that one joke at the end just doesn't land particularly well. So both of these you can see on YouTube, because I've found a copy of No Men Beyond This Point on YouTube. You can watch it with an occasional ad thrown in, but it's worth checking out. I'll post links to both of these movies on the description of this video. Alternate universe mockumentaries. I think there's still breathing space to make some more of those, and I'd like to see more of them. And I'll put my bum on a seat and watch them. So that's what I got for you this time around. Alternate universe mockumentaries. 2 of them. There are probably more, but they're the two I thought of while I was looking through my old archives. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. You can also support the channel by becoming either a channel member or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Next up, we've got the Monday video, which I know what I'm doing for that. And I've also got a lot of stuff coming in from Umbrella Entertainment, which is going to well and truly take me out of my comfort zone as far as movie watching is concerned. So until all of that adventure happens, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Watch some alternate universe movies because they are always fun, even if they're not done perfectly. And I'll catch you next time.